With the coming of spring, the desolate emptiness of the Bane echoed once again to the armoured shod footsteps of armies. The clans had gathered their forces, this time not for exploration, but for conquest. But as spring draws into summer, draws into autumn, and we near the end of the campaigning season, what has happened? Have there been any conquests? What new discoveries have been made? Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're looking at the ending of part 2 of the Bane Wars campaign. Hi, I'm Rob Poyton. Thanks for joining me today for this look at part 2 of the Bane Wars campaign. You may remember in part 1 we had 4 players whose forces came into the Bane largely for exploration. They did have some set objectives, but also they were discovering things as they went along, as they discovered, for example, the City of Spiders, the City of Ghosts, the big mining operation, the old volcano. All these locations gave them clues as to the background and lore of the Bane area and why this war, this devastating war, happened all those generations ago. So within that, of course, they're also finding artifacts, they're finding things out about the other clans, but the main aim was this exploration, find things out, bring that back before the campaign season ends. So that all concluded successfully, and we got into part 2. We had 2 new players. We had my friend Niels from California. He stepped in to take over the command of the Orc armies up to the north. And we did have the Dwarf clan in part 1, but really they, most of the time, they just provided dragon fodder for the Fire Elves, I think. This time we were lucky enough to have Duncan come in to actually take charge of the Dwarfs. And of course, one of their main objectives was to reclaim the mines that the elves took from them. And yeah, a little bit of vengeance in there as well, I think. So we had 6 armies, 5 players. I took control of the vampires as before, and I was also running the ICC army to the south, which was a bit of a late discovery in part 1. They didn't really take part in the campaign as such, but they were a presence to the south. For part 2, they're bringing their armies out. Now, I think as I explained before, obviously my own army I run as I see fit, and I try to ignore any information that I would not have as a vampire commander. Obviously, in running the game, I've got a very good overview of what's going on. With what we might call an NPC army, like the ICC, I tend to work a lot with dice rolls to make things a little bit more random. So that I could manage my own army and one other. However, as things turned out, I ended up running 3 armies. We had a player who joined in at the start of part 1, but didn't get too engaged with the game. He sent in a few sets of orders. I was able from that to basically keep his army moving and army working. He insisted that he wanted to take part in part 2, so we brought him in with the same army. However, quite quickly he said, actually, no, I don't really have time to do this. I think he sent in 1 or 2 orders maybe. No time to do this, so I'm going to have to pull out. That left me with another army to command. Now, the problem I had here was this army was neighbouring the vampire forces. With the ICC humans, they're way down south. Not really got anything to do with the vampires, at least in the early stages. With these direct neighbours, one of the ways I structured the campaign was that they would be able to stop the vampires from gaining their main objective, because to get to that objective, the vampires had to go through their territory. With the absence of that, and you know, making it difficult for me then to play 2 sides that are directly opposing, it did leave the way open for the vampires to pretty much march straight down to their objective without any real problem at all. Well, take a look at the map in a moment and you can see how that all panned out. But what it did mean was then, as the campaign went on, it was increasingly difficult for me to control 3 armies, and also one of the other players felt that this unbalanced the campaign, and fair enough, is quite right. So at a later stage, that player also said, okay, well, I've got most of my objectives. What my army is going to do now is this, and I won't be, engaging with any of the other clans as such. In effect, that brought the campaign to an end. It's a shame because, we like to end a campaign with a big battle, a huge sort of cataclysmic battle at the end. In fact, I think we had less battles in this one than in the first one. And given that the brief this time was this is a campaign of conquest rather than exploration, that was a little bit disappointing. I did get an outing with the vampires, so that was something. I think what we'll do is we'll go to the map and I'll take you through how things actually panned out. Here's our Bane Wars map then. As I mentioned, we've got the orcs at the top here, vampires, high elves, dwarves, the Iceci, the fire elves, and the bears. So let's just go through each in turn. I'll give you a quick rundown of where they went and what they did. The orcs largely stayed in this northern area. The bear clan on the first campaign moved into this area, which was one of their objectives, their sacred burial grounds, and occupied a fortress. So they were already sort of firmly entrenched here. This did, I think, sort of hem the orcs in a little bit because the orcs explored across the top here, and in fact they did attack and take over a bear clan fortress here, but then had to retreat. So they really only worked in this area. I think they were looking at coming south through here, but they had a strong bear clan force here, and also a fire elf force came across to reinforce as well. So the orcs were a little bit hemmed in. They did come across and bother the vampires. There was a battle, you may remember, at that village here, which the orcs won. But again, they had to retreat because they're very close to the vampire homeland. And of course, there's a major vampire force just sort of lurking here as well. So the orcs did their best, unable to break through there. Perhaps if they had an alliance with the vampires, they might have been able to do something here. But they did do a lot of activity in this top northern region. The vampires, were they interested in an alliance with the orcs? Not really, because their prime objective was down to the south here, the city of spiders. So, without giving away too much background lore and spoilers, the vampires already had control of the volcano, which seems to relate to dragon eggs in part one of the campaign. They also had the city of ghosts, which was their primary objective, and they'd had sort of various brushes with the fire elves and the dwarves and the humans down this central area as well. So their plan here was simply to take the whole army down to the city of spiders. And because the high elves were not particularly active here, they were able to do that unopposed. The high elf objective in this part of the campaign was this location here, which is a sort of wizard's tower and fortress. This was the place where the apocalyptic magical weapon that ended the Bane War and caused all that devastation, this is where it was actually created and formed. So again, without going too much into spoilers, that was what the High Elves were looking for. The Dwarves down to the south, they'd been forced to retreat out of their mining operation. So they brought their army out from here, and they didn't really get much further than this point. We had the vampires coming down from there. The dwarves decided just they made an alliance with the vampires to let them do whatever they wanted in the city of spiders, and they kind of monitored here. Now, of course, the dwarves are going to want to get their fortress back and their mine at some point. So I think the plan was there maybe to make an alliance with the Iceci. In fact, the dwarves did have a little expeditionary force. There they are, just out there. They went roaming here and caused some upset for the fire elves in their mining operation. They basically cut this line here, which was ferrying the mithril from the mines back out to the fire elf homeland. And the dwarves did manage to cut that, and capture a lot of Mithrium supplies, which again, that's one of their objectives. The ICC didn't really play an active role in part 1. They definitely did in this because they've got a major beef with the Fire Elves. This is all tied up with dragon lore, and they also want to get up to the volcanoes here because it's quite possible they have possession of a dragon's egg, which was gifted to them by the vampires. So there's an alliance between the ICC and the vampires. Their main thing here was they were going to take over this fortress to establish that as a good supply post and then move up to the volcanoes. The Fire Elves, as in part 1, roamed far and wide. They've got their mining operation established here because they kicked out the dwarves in part 1. So that's all ticking over nicely. They discover some more lore from that place. They're very interested in the volcano because they have dragons and they know that the volcano has got something to do with the background of the dragons. So that was their main objective again. They got across to that. On the way, they also decided to leave 2 forces, one here, sort of threatening the City of Ghosts, and they also had a force up here, that alliance with the Bear Clan, which did a lot to discourage the orcs to come back down. They did make it all the way across to the volcano, which the vampires just evacuated. The vampires didn't fight for it for various reasons of law, but they pretty much said to the Fire Elves, okay, you can have it. The Bear Clan, as I said, already had their objective from part 1 of the campaign, so really for them it was about consolidating this area. They had a big ritual event going on at the sacred grounds, which they were keen to protect, and they didn't really pay much else attention to what was going on outside of that space. There was a little incident down here with some gargoyles. They were potentially going to attack the gargoyle town. The gargoyles had made something of an alliance with the orcs, but that sort of fell apart. And in the end, it was the vampires who said to the gargoyles, well, come down into the City of Ghosts and we'll look after you. So that alliance sort of switched a little bit. However, here it was mainly consolidating and holding, and well, they certainly did the job in terms of keeping those orcs bottled up in the mountains up here. Overall then, as we finish, the orcs probably a little bit frustrated. They're not been able to get out. They kicked some arse, but not as much arse as they would have liked to. The vampires have reached their objective. They're ready for stage 3, which involves something happening in the City of Spiders, and maybe even the Lich Queen herself coming out, venturing forth and going down to there. The High Elves effectively just stopped there and nothing else happened. The Dwarves are probably getting a little bit nervous because they've got 2 other big armies in the region, and they've still not quite wreaked their revenge on the Fire Elves there. The ICC are well set for part 3 if they want to get up to the volcano. The Fire Elves are probably going to have something to say about that, I would think. And the Bear Clan, well, they're sort of sitting pretty. They've got this whole area pretty much tied up. I guess the thing now is, can they defend it? So yeah, although the ending didn't quite pan out as I'd expected, I hope for some major battles here, or maybe when the ICC got up here, big battle between them and the Fire Elves with the vampires and the High Elves involved. Although that didn't pan out, I want to say a big thanks to all the players who took part, and particularly for being so involved in the diplomacy early on. There are a huge amount of messages going backwards and forwards, promises made, promises broken, discoveries made about the lore and history of the area, and I feel that really did help build the narrative of the campaign. So there we go, that's how things finished up. As I said, disappointing not to have more battles. I thought there'd be a lot more direct confrontation this time. I think it is interesting that when you play a one-off battle, everyone charges in, right? And it's to the last man or orc or dwarf or elf or whatever it is. When you play campaigns, everyone is a lot more cagey. I think people are very aware of if they commit their forces here and it goes wrong, then they suddenly leave their whole left flank open for another lot to come in and, you know, just sweep across their villages and perhaps even into their homelands as well. So that is an interesting aspect. However, on the positive side, we did get a lot more lore going on this time. In fact, the actions of the players and how they began interacting, because at the start there was a lot of cross communication, a lot of diplomacy going on. This gave me some ideas to really develop the lore of the Bane as well. And as it turns out, I didn't know this when I first started. The Bane Wars was really begun by the elves. There were three elf houses or elf clans prior to the war beginning, and due to various machinations and jealousies and rivalries, it was really those three houses of elves that kicked the whole thing off, and then the humans got pulled in and the dwarves got pulled in and everything else. Now within that, there's a lot of things happened that I'm not really going to talk about because I don't want to put out any spoilers. Also, I have started writing the first Bane Wars novella as well, which charts the course of the first campaign. So, again, I don't want to give away any spoilers as far as the lore is concerned, because I'm probably going to build that up into a trilogy. As I'm working on publishing more RPG material this year, I'm also thinking of putting out a Bane Wars setting book for fantasy campaigns. So although we use and always highly recommend Fantastic Battles as our rule set, this will be rules agnostic. It basically look at the overall setting for the Bane, maps, locations, what goes on, what has gone on, what is in there now, and also that background lore that I mentioned. So a person who wants to run a campaign can take all this information and set something up quite easily. Of course, we'll look at how armies are supplied, communications, diplomacy, and all those sort of things as well. So that's something that I plan on starting maybe later in the spring or summer. I've got a few other projects on the boil at the moment. So if this campaign series has sparked your imagination and you like to run your own version, then do keep an eye out for that. That's it then for part two. Lessons learned. I think it's a difficult situation because this happens in gaming. I mean, even in the sense of you want to put on a Second World War game, Normandy campaign, 3 platoons aside, etc., etc. You need some other players to do that. Sometimes, even if you're a member of a club, that can be difficult to organise just to get everyone together on a specific night. If you're running a campaign, of course, there's an extra level of commitment from the players involved as well. So I think if you're thinking of joining a campaign, just think, how much time will this take, and can I commit to that? Can I commit to sending in a weekly order or fortnightly or whatever it is? So one person did in this campaign mention something about, oh, there's a lot of bookkeeping involved, which I sort of took umbrage with a little bit, because really, once you've constructed your army, all you had to do each week was send me the direction and the amount of hexes they're going to move. Now, granted, you could have split your army up into 3 bits, so that might be 3 forces you're moving on the map. But as far as bookkeeping goes, that was it. We weren't doing bookkeeping for supplies. There was a little bit maybe on if you discovered gold pieces or you wanted to spend gold pieces on things like espionage. But I intentionally kept that side of it very minimal, because I've been involved in campaigns before. And when you've got to work out, right, how many arrows do 5 units of archers need? So I've got to send 6 wagons back. I didn't really want that sort of campaign. Of course, other people might enjoy that side of it. So I think make clear from the start from your players what the commitment is, what is involved in them taking part in the campaign. And you have to stress that, of course, things happen. And I take some of the blame for this in this campaign. I was away for a few weeks. I had some other issues going on. So over one period at the end of last year, we did get a bit stop-start with it, which was down to me. That doesn't help the situation. But everyone involved needs to know what the campaign's about and what is expected of them. And this goes the same for if you're setting up a RPG campaign. We've got our Mothership campaign starting up in a couple of weeks' time. Pleased to say we've got a group come in for that. I'm going to be running that online fortnightly. Most of the players have already sent their characters in, so that is looking good and shaping up to be a good campaign. This is not confined to wargaming, by the way. As a musician of long standing, and any other musician will tell you, unless you're going out solo or maybe as a duo, you need 4 or 5 people for a band, maybe 3 minimum. Getting that level of commitment from musicians to rehearse every week, to get the set together, to maybe write new material if you're originals band, and then of course to get into your gigging circuit is very, very, very difficult. And in fact, I would say as I've gone on in my music career, so-called, it has got more and more difficult. People seem less and less inclined to commit themselves to a project, which is fine if people tell you that at the start. No, it's not my thing. It's not what I want to do. What does grind the gears a little bit is you might get 3 or 4 months into something and the drummer says, you know, I don't really like this sort of music. It's not really my cup of tea. So, you know, effectively you have to Control-Alt-Delete and reset, get a new drummer in, take them through the set, and you start the whole process again. That can get very wearing, of course, not to mention expensive because you're playing for rehearsal time. So if you're setting up a campaign or you're thinking of taking part in a campaign, do make sure you know what's involved. Make sure you've got the time to make the commitment. Will there be a part 3? You know, there's a lot of things left unresolved at the moment. Certainly from that standpoint, we need a part 3 to conclude everything. Am I going to be able to get a group who will run through that? Well, possibly. We've got a good core group there. If it's something you'd be interested in, then do drop me a line and let me know. We've got 1 or 2 armies spare. And obviously you can watch this series, or of course, I'd fill you in on all the background and the lore and everything that's happened up until now. But I've not got any immediate plans for that. As I said, I've got that Mothership campaign starting up soon. That's going to be my main focus up until the summer. After that, maybe we'll see, who knows. I do have a very nice vampire army that I would like to field at some point. All right, so thanks very much for joining me again today. I do hope you found this campaign interesting. As always, any comments, questions, or experiences, particularly from a running the campaign perspective, I'd be very interested to hear. Do keep an eye out for those Bane Wars books and possibly the campaign setting coming out later in the year. In fact, if you want to keep in touch with what I've got going on here, then just click the subscribe button below if you haven't already, and that will certainly keep you in the loop. Also, take a look at our Innsmouth forum as well. That's set up in conjunction with our Innsmouth Book Club podcast, but there's a lot of gaming and other talk going on there as well now. And I'll pop the link up to that down in the notes below. Until next time, take care.